I think people will need to develop their own relationship to this crisis that transcends just above like mutely digesting static facts coming to you through your news feed. But I think for me, what spirituality has offered, and I'm defining that extremely broadly, as you'll probably glean once you read the book, my spirituality includes such practices as swearing off Twitter for the rest of my life and trying to take a long walk without my phone every day and just like look at a fern or something. But I think what spiritual practice helps do for me is I think creating something that is daily and mundane, but also seeks to make contact with something like the eternal, can, at least in small moments, make you feel like you can step out of the temporal maelstrom that is the climate crisis, this thing that's like jostling and mixing and making turbulent the intersections between geologic, historic, and biographical time. That you can either step above that into the everywhen of the dream time, as Aboriginals have it, or step below that into just whatever's happening in front of you. There are still ways to find solid ground under your feet, even if you're in the middle of an earthquake, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I came across your work on a Know Your Enemy episode where you were in a panel discussion with Dorothy Fortenberry, who you referenced earlier. She's a playwright. She writes for Handmaid's Tale, and she's still a practicing Catholic. And she gave this great review on that podcast of Pope Francis's Laudate Si.
Mm-hmm. And a phenomenal document. And an incredibly radical document.
Yeah. Now, she said something that I want to talk with her directly about. So please check your emails, Dorothy, which is that for her, like weekly mass and ritual is not narrative driven. I'm ex-Catholic myself, and I remember that there was this difference between the liturgical calendar and the school year, for example. So you can eat the transmuted body of Jesus every week, but it's not a magic pill. You're going to come back the next week. And so for her, she was saying that the church didn't offer answers so much as a space for relationship and contemplation. So how about for you? You've described the long walks and the fern and swearing off Twitter, but do you still go to synagogue at all?
I do sometimes, not as much as my mother would probably want me to, but right. I'm going, I'll be in synagogue all day on Thursday for Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, where we meditate on and try to atone for our sins, which is a very heavy and perhaps maudlin, but sometimes useful process, I find. But my religious as opposed to spiritual practice is not nearly as consistent as Dorothy's. I think she's totally right in that these spaces are one form of feeling like the social fabric is still intact, which is a feeling that I think is getting more and more rare in the 21st century for a lot of people. But I also think that my Judaism, and again, this is less of a practice, but I grew up in a household and I was taught from a very young age about the concept of tikkun olam, which basically means that you, the reason you're alive is to help heal the world. That's the literal translation. It's like similar to the seventh generation concept in American indigenous cosmologies. And that's really been an orienting force for me, and contributes to my antifatalism. Because as I said in that other conversation, I think, the climate crisis is going to get worse before it gets better. But every single increment we manage to mitigate how bad it gets, we save or preserve the lives and livelihoods of millions of people whose lives are of equal and inherent value to ours. And I sometimes I don't want to use the word lucky because that's really not what the feeling is like. I feel kind of unlikely to be born right as the climate crisis came into public consciousness. But I do feel that it's sort of strange that in our lifetimes, if we so choose, we get to engage in this social movement, the meaning and consequence of which is almost indescribable. Like, the stakes are really hard to fathom. And, a part of me feels like I can't imagine, or that is one version of the best human life in my respect, from a vision of like tikkun olam. So I wouldn't say, I think Jewish religious frameworks have really helped orient me and keep me motivated. And yeah, you can ask my mom. I still go on the high holidays.
Well, I mean, given that that's your background, I got to say, I'm not quite sure of the sound I made when I read that your therapist handed you a copy of Eckhart Tolle. Because it was like something between I don't know, a sigh and I don't know, a little bit of a choke. Because like in my world, he's just the worst kind of like dissociative numpty who like melted the brains of an entire generation on being in the moment, and also helped to depoliticize them. And then you write really eloquently about how much the book helped you. And so I had to eat my words a little bit. Was that your first exposure to like modern versions of non-dual philosophy? And what did it offer you that the Torah and Talmud and is it Tikkun Olam?
Tikkun olam, yeah.
Yeah. What did it offer that those things didn't?
It's a good question. I mean, I guess I'll start by saying that Eckhart Tolle, I think, presents his particular version of non-dual philosophy as a kind of panacea, which I just really don't think it is. I think it was, for me, useful in very specific ways in a very specific point in my life, which was basically I was feeling like the great acceleration was this giant treadmill that was continually speeding up. And by the great acceleration, I'm using it, this is the term that various postmodern theorists use to describe the era of surveillance capitalism and the climate crisis and incredible technological innovation and uptake. That thing was just exhausting me on a daily basis and constantly yanking me into the future against my will. And the most beautiful parts of my day were the parts where I could step out of that slipstream and have a direct sensory experience with some set of stimuli. It's hard to describe, but, for example, looking at a fern on a walk. And Tolle offered some frameworks to think about how to be more intentional about that stepping when it felt needed. But I also felt, especially when I engaged more with Aboriginal cosmologies, that the now is such a thin it's such a thin concept of time, and kind of ungenerous in that it retracts ontological weight from people that have come before us and people that come after us. And as you say, is very depoliticizing, because if you always live in the now, it's unclear how you bend the long arc of it's unclear how you bend the long arc of history towards justice, because history doesn't exist. It's just a series of moments. And so I found the everyone much more helpful. But I'm resistant to the idea of any one body of thought having the silver bullet here. I mean, I think we're all kind of creating this patchwork emotional and philosophical vehicle that we're going to use to try to get through a crisis that we can't quite